Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. I hope you're doing good. Today, we are going to carry on with the first year students module of civilization. The previous video, I have spoken about the Norman conquest. How did William the Conqueror or William the First conquered England, and how was he governing England, although he was French? And I have spoken about the term feudalism, feudal system, and how William has distributed lands to his nobles, and he was very wise in doing so. I have spoken about the two battles, Fulford and Hastings. Now I shall move to his sons, and as we say, the kingship as a family business. So to understand the idea of kingship and lordship in the early Middle Ages, it is important to realize that at the time there was little or no idea of nationalism. So at that time, we didn't have elections to elect a new king. Kingship was by inheritance, because they had the idea that these kings were sent by God of Himself, and which we call the divine rights of kings. So William, the first king, the first Norman king of England, controlled two large areas: Normandy, which he had been given by his father, and England, which he had won in war. Both were personal possessions, and it did not matter to the rulers that the ordinary people of one place were English, while those of others were French. To William, the important difference between Normandy and England was that as a Duke of Normandy he had to recognize the King of France as his lord, whereas in England he was king with lord or with no lord above him. So being a duke in Normandy, he had to acknowledge, he had to pay homage to the King of France, because being a duke, I have already spoken about this, being a duke does not mean you are the supreme power. You need to pay homage to your king. It means there is a man who is more powerful than you, and you need to pay him services, homage, according to the feudal system. But being a king, you do not have a lord, only God, of course, but you are the supreme authority in a country. So when William I, or William the Conqueror, died in 1087, he left the duchy of Normandy to his elder son. So basically he had two sons. He had Robert and he had Rufus. So when William died, he didn't left only the kingship of England. He also left the duchy of Normandy, because he was duke in France and king in England. So he left the duchy of Normandy to his elder son Robert, and he gave England, or the kingship of England, to his second son William, or also known under the name of Rufus. When Robert went to fight the Muslims in the Holy Land, because Robert was a duke, so he needed to obey the orders of his king, or also known the King of France. Um, so when Robert went to fight the Muslims, he left William II in charge of Normandy. So at that time, when we say William II, it means Rufus. At that time, Rufus was governing England and Normandy, the duchy of his brother. Then William, or Rufus, died in a hunting accident, shot by an arrow. He had not married, and therefore he had no son to take the crown. At the time of William's death, Robert was on his way home to Normandy from the Holy Land. Their younger brother, Henry, knew that if he wanted the English throne, he could have to act very quickly. He needed to act fast in order to take the throne, because they had let's say, a younger brother named Henry. He had been with William at the time of the accident. So when William was killed, or when Rufus was killed, Henry, sorry, Henry was present during the accident. So what did Henry did? He rode to Winchester and took charge of the king's treasury. He then rode to Westminster, where he was crowned king. 3 days later, of course, Robert was very angry and he prepared to invade, but it took him years or a year to organize an army. So basically, what happened, Rufus was killed in a hunting accident, and it is still a mystery who killed him. But at that time, Robert was fighting in the Holy Land, and Henry, their younger brother, was present during the accident. So he noticed that Robert was away. It was the right time to take the kingship of England. So Robert was angry when he heard that his younger brother usurped his kingship, which was his right. So the Norman nobles in England had to choose between Henry and Robert. This was not easy because most of them held land in Normandy too. In the end, they chose Henry because he was in London with the crown already on his head, so they didn't want to get in details and problems, etc. So we have Henry, he is the king, we shall pay him homage, and he would grow powerful. So then, of course, they choose Henry over England because he was in London, and like I said, he was already king. So Robert, when he raised an army, he invaded England, but it was a failure, and he accepted payment. He wanted to be paid in return, or in return he would go to Normandy without making any kind of problems anymore. But Henry wanted more. He knew that many of his nobles would willingly follow him to Normandy so that they could win back their Norman lands, because the English nobles had lands in Normandy, and Henry wanted to invade Normandy and to take back those lands for himself and of course for his nobles. He knew that they would accept to invade Normandy. So in 1106, Henry invaded Normandy and captured Robert. Normandy and England were reunited under one ruler. So Robert was no longer the Duke of Normandy, since he was captured by his brother Henry. Henry I, or Henry I's most important aim was to pass on both Normandy and England to his successor, to his son. He spent the rest of his life fighting to keep Normandy from other French nobles who tried to take it. These lands, these English lands in France, some French nobles wanted to take them back because they thought it was their right, since they are French and the English are taking the French lands, etc. But in 1120, Henry's only son was drowned at sea, so he lost his son. During the next 15 years, Henry hoped for another son, but finally accepted that his daughter Matilda. So he had a son, and his son had a little boy, and Henry had also a daughter called Matilda. So he finally accepted that his daughter Matilda would follow him. Henry had married Matilda to another great noble in France. This noble is named Geoffrey, I guess. He was heir to Anjou, a place in France, a large and important area southeast of Normandy. Henry hoped that the family lands would be made larger by this marriage in order to grow prosperous and to become powerful. He made all the nobles, the English nobles, promise to accept Matilda when he died. But Henry himself quarreled publicly with Matilda's husband, Geoffrey. And after this quarrel, Henry died. This left the succession in question: who would be the next king or queen of England? At, let's say, the time, both the possible heirs to Henry were on their own estates. Matilda was with her husband in Anjou, and Henry's nephew, Stephen of Blois, was in Boulogne, only a day's journey by sea from England. As Henry had done before him, Stephen raced to England, just like his grandfather Henry did. He raced to England to claim the crown. Also, as before, the nobles in England had to choose between Stephen who was in England, and Matilda, who had quarreled with her father and who was still in France. So the same story, but in a different generation. Most choose Stephen, who seemed to have been good at fighting but little else. He was described at the time as of outstanding skill in arms, but in other things almost an idiot, except that he was more inclined towards evil. Only few nobles supported Matilda's claim. Matilda invaded England 4 years later. Her fight with Stephen led to a terrible civil war. So we have a civil war between Matilda and Stephen of Blois. Both of them are quarreling who would govern England. So this terrible civil war in which villages were destroyed and many people were killed. Neither side could win, and finally, in 1153, Matilda and Stephen agreed that Stephen could keep the throne, but only if Matilda's son Henry could succeed him. Fortunately for England, Stephen died the following year, and the family possessions of England and the lands in France were united under a king accepted by everyone. It took years for England to recover from the Civil War. So, as someone wrote, I think it's in Extra Information, someone wrote at the time, for 19 long winters, God and his angels slept. This kind of disorder. So, the results of this terrible civil war resulted in a huge disorder and sorry, and this disorder and destruction in Europe as in England. But it was shocking in England because people were used to rule of law and order. It was one of the first bloodiest English civil war. So the son of Matilda took the throne right after the death of Stephen of Blois under the name of Henry II. Henry II was the first unquestioned ruler of the English throne for 100 years. He destroyed the castles which many nobles had built without royal permission. During Stephen's reign, and of course, during Stephen's reign, his nobles built a lot of castles throughout the country without even his permission. But at the arrival of Henry II, he destroyed these castles and made sure that the nobles would live in manor houses that were undefended in order to revive the trust between ordinary people and the nobles and the king in general. So the manor here became the center of local life and administration, just like during the Saxon life. Henry II was ruler of far more land than any previous king. He was very powerful. As Lord of Anjou, he added his father's land to the family empire. After his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, he also ruled the land south of Anjou, so his empire was big and powerful. Henry's second empire expanded, or we can say stretched, from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. England provided most of Henry's wealth, but the heart of his empire lay in Anjou, and although Henry recognized the King of France as the overlord of all his French lands, he actually controlled a greater area than the King of France. Although he was powerful, more powerful than the King of France, he acknowledged the King of France as his overlord. Many of Henry's nobles held land on both sides of the English Channel. So some nobles had lands in England and they had lands in France as well. However, later Henry quarreled with his wife, and powerful wife, by the way, and his sons Richard and John. So basically, Henry II had two sons, Richard and John. When he quarreled with their mother, these two heirs, future heirs to the English kingship, they took the side of Eleanor, their mother. So it may seem surprising that Richard and John fought against their own father, but in fact they were doing their duty to the King of France. Why did they choose to fight their father, Henry? because both of them had lands in France, and these lands were granted by the King of France. So whenever he gave them the order to fight the English king, which was believed to be their father, they did so because they had to do it. They were obliged. This is how it used to work in the feudal system. So Richard and John fought against their own father, but like I said, they were doing their duty to the King of France. In payment, because they were granted lands, and in 1189 Henry died as a broken man, disappointed and defeated by his sons and by the French king. Henry was followed by his rebellious son Richard. So Richard, under the name of Richard I, has always been one of England's most popular kings. Although he spent hardly any time in England, he was brave and a good soldier. But his nickname, Coeur de Lion, instead of Lionheart, shows that his culture, like that of the kings before him, was French. He was first called Coeur de Lion in France rather than Lionheart. So Richard was everyone's idea of the perfect feudal king. He went to the Holy Land to make war on the Muslims, and he fought with skill, courage, and honor. So he was brave, and he was appreciated by everyone. On his way back from the Holy Land, Richard was captured by the Duke of Austria, with whom he had quarreled in Jerusalem. So when they were waging wars against the Muslims, Richard quarreled with another Duke of Austria. But when Richard decided to go back to France, he was captured by this duke, and the duke demanded money or asked for money before he would let him go. And it took 2 years for England to pay. Shortly after, in let's say around 1198 or 99, Richard was killed in France. He had spent no more than 4 or 5 years in the country, of which, of course, he was king. When he died, the French king took over parts of Richard's French lands to rule himself. So here, the French are reclaiming their own lands. By the way, Richard had no son, so he couldn't be followed by his heir, but he was followed by his brother John. John was the exact opposite of Richard. He had already made himself unpopular with the three most important groups of people: the nobles, the merchants, and the church. John was unpopular mainly because he was greedy. The feudal lords in England had always run their own law, courts, and profited from the fines paid by those brought to court. But John took many cases out of their courts and tried them in the king's courts, taking the money for himself. So he was very greedy. He didn't stick to the law. He did his own way of trying people, and because Henry before him, he said that if we have outlaws, it disrupted the king's peace. So it was a great deal at that time to try people in the court. It was normal for a feudal lord to make payment to the king when his daughter was married, but John asked for more than was the custom. In the same way, when a noble died, his son had to pay money before he could inherit his father's land in order to enlarge his own income. So basically, in the feudal system, when a noble dies, so a noble has lands or a land, this land would go to his son, right? But with during the reign of John, he changed that. He took the lands because he imposed on the sons of the nobles to pay him in order to give them the lands of their fathers. So, like I said, when a noble died, his son had to pay money before he could inherit his father's land. In order to enlarge his own income, John increased the amount they had to pay. In other cases, when a noble died without a son, it was normal for the land to be passed on to another noble family. John kept the land for a long time to benefit from its wealth. He died the same with the bishoprics as for the merchants and towns. He taxed them at a higher level than ever before. So people started hating John and they wanted to rebel against him. In 1204, King John became even more unpopular with his nobles. The French king invaded Normandy, and the English nobles lost their lands there. John had failed to carry out his duty to them as Duke of Normandy. He had taken their money, but he had not protected their land. So when we speak about the feudal system, the king grants lands for his nobles, and his nobles pay him homage in order or in return for protection. So when you have the king had to protect the lands of the nobles, and the nobles had to protect the lands of the knights had to protect the lands of ordinary people or even serfs. But King John didn't do that. In 1209, John quarreled with the Pope over who should be the Archbishop of Canterbury. John was in a weak position in England, and the Pope knew it. The Pope called on the King of France to invade England and closed every church in the country. At a time when most people believed that without the church they would go to hell, this was a very serious matter. In 1214, John gave in and accepted the Pope's choice of Archbishop. In 1215, John hoped to recapture Normandy. He called on his lords to fight for him, but they no longer trusted him. They marched to London, where they were joined by angry merchants outside London at Runnymede. A few miles up to the river, John was forced to sign a new agreement, which is called the Magna Carta. So I know it is long, but I wanted to give as much details as I could, and I hope that it is clear. If you have any kind of question, feel free to ask in the comments below. I'm going to leave my personal email. Contact me if needed. I'll answer as soon as I see your message. Now, I tell you, have a great day and peace. See you in the next video.